The Vietnam War was a long, costly armed conflict that pitted the communist regime of North Vietnam and its southern allies, known as the Viet Cong, against South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The war ended with the withdrawal of the United States forces in 1973 and the unification of Vietnam under communist control 2 years later. More than 3 million people, including 58,000 Americans, were killed in the conflict. America's involvement began in the early 1960s.
In early August of 1964, U.S. soldiers stationed at the Gulf of Tonkin radioed that the North Vietnamese forces had fired upon them. Johnson responded by asking Congress for permission to expand military expansion in Vietnam. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which authorized the president to take any measures that he believed necessary to maintain peace.
As expansion into Vietnam increased, there was a greater need for troops. During this war, about two-thirds of the troops were volunteers, and the remaining one-third were selected through the draft.
So, the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War led to the conscription in the U.S., or what we know as the draft. It was one of the most remembered controversies linked to Vietnam, and it allowed the government to increase the amount of troops at any time of the war. Men from the ages of 18 through 26, 21 being the average, were subject to the draft. Because the war wasn't popular at home, many men protested by burning their draft cards and fleeing to Canada to avoid fighting. Draft evasion wasn't a federal or criminal offense in Canada, so that was a popular go-to spot for the men avoiding the draft. A total of 100,000 Dodgers fled the U.S. in an effort to protest the war. One-third of the men who went to the war were selected through the draft.
Protest to conscription reached its peak during the Vietnam War. As the 1960s went on, draft resistance nearly crippled the selective service system through teach-ins and protests.
The movement against U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War began small, only among peace activists and leftist intellectuals on college campuses, but gained national prominence in 1965 after the U.S. began bombing North Vietnam in earnest. April 1970, President Nixon announced U.S. invasion of Cambodia and the need to draft 150,000 more soldiers. This provoked protests on campuses throughout the country. At Kent State University, protesters rallied and set fire to the Reserve Officers Training Corps building, sparking the dispatch of 900 National Guardsmen to the campus. On May 4th, 28 guardsmen opened fire on a crowd, killing 4 and wounding 9. This caused unrest throughout the country, and almost 500 colleges were shut down due to protests. The shootings have come to symbolize the deep political and social divisions that divided the country during the Vietnam War era.
As the resistance movement took off at home, war was beginning in Vietnam. Overseas, the U.S. troops fought brutally against the Viet Cong forces.
For arms and ammunition in the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong relied heavily on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The U.S. used a chemical called Agent Orange in this war. It was a powerful mix of chemicals to eliminate forest cover for North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops. It was later revealed to cause serious health issues. Napalm was another substance used by the troops during this war. It was a mix of plastic, polyester, hydrocarbon, and gas. It was a jelly-like substance that, when ignited, sticks to practically anything and burns up to 10 minutes.
Both napalm and Agent Orange were extremely harmful and dangerous to the environment in Vietnam and the Vietnamese people. Unlike many of the wars before, media was able to expose what was happening overseas with those back at home in the United States.
Because of the U.S. involvement in Vietnam and the spur of the television, for the first time in history, there were overseas broadcasts of the war. The TV was a big source of the news and info to the people of the United States. The media was able to record the war and air it on TV so the people at home could view. It was ultimately largely controlled by the government, but still gave needed information to the citizens at home.
As the media showed what was happening in Indochina, protests became increasingly popular. Citizens began to question the United States' role in Vietnam and wanted peace.
Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS, was the largest and most influential radical student organization of the 1960s. With the escalation of the Vietnam War, Students for a Democratic Society grew very quickly as young people were more willing to protest the destruction brought about by the U.S. government and military. On March 11, 1965, a year after the war began, SDS held its first teach-in at the University of Michigan. The teach-ins wanted to cover a variety of issues, tactics, and theories in order to allow for dynamic and inclusive explorations of the war and how to stop it. The teach-ins took place after evening classes and went on until early morning. They consisted of lectures, debates, film viewings, musical performances, and workshops, usually finishing with a large rally the next morning. Teach-ins were an effective act of the resistance because it was a protest rather than a debate.
As education about how to stop the war was taught through teach-ins and protests, the troops in Vietnam were far from reaching peace with the northern Vietnamese forces. The government ignored the citizens at home, and the brutality of war continued.
In 1968, some 70,000 North Vietnamese and also the Viet Cong forces launched the Tet Offensive. It was a coordinated series of fierce attacks on more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam. The leader of the Communist People's Army of Vietnam planned the offensive in an attempt both to foment rebellion among the South Vietnamese population and encourage the United States to scale back its support of the Saigon regime. News coverage of the offense shocked and dismayed the American public and further eroded support for the war effort. Though it endured heavy casualties, North Vietnam achieved a strategic victory and marked as a turning point.
The Tet Offensive marked the beginning of the end of the Vietnam War. The surprise attacks on the American troops were detrimental to U.S. victory. The government called for more than 200,000 more troops to fight back. This led to an uproar of anger towards war.
The Vietnam War sparked a huge anti-war sentiment throughout the U.S. The government's initial claim was that American involvement was at the request of the South Vietnam government in order to help repel communist aggression from the North. After the media showed what was really happening overseas, Americans became critical. Many argued that the use of bomb and artillery was too indiscriminate and that too many innocent civilians were in danger. After word about the 1968 My Lai massacre spread, Americans were extremely critical of the way the war was being fought. As the war came to an end and troops came back, they were not welcomed like the veterans of the world wars, but they were instead rejected and called baby killers.
Shortly after the Tet Offensive, the president realized that continuing to fight the war wasn't worth all of the fatalities. Johnson declared that he was limiting the bombing of North Vietnam and negotiated to end the war.
The resolution of the Vietnamese War ultimately came down to a ceasefire in 1973. North Vietnam's attacks on South Vietnam proved to be too much. Ceasefire signed by the U.S., South Vietnam, and North Vietnam. And the conditions of this ceasefire were U.S. remove all troops, North Vietnam keep whatever land they had won, and North Vietnam may resume the war. In 1975, North Vietnam beat South Vietnam. Ultimately, 3 billion Vietnamese were killed and 58,000 U.S. people killed, with 300,000 wounded. $150 billion were spent by the U.S. in this war as a total.
The Vietnam War was a prolonged struggle in an attempt to unify Vietnam. America's goal to stop the spread of communism ultimately failed. The Vietnam War was fought from 1954 to 1973. The Vietnam War was the longest war up until 2002. However, it is arguably still the most brutal. 1 out of 10 soldiers were killed or injured, and 1,700 are still unaccounted for today.